And we're live. It is Sunday, May 16th, 2021, and we have a cicada update for you from our mystery guest, David Priest. David, what is the cicada situation immediately in back of you?
I can report live as your cicada correspondent that in Northern Virginia, we have hundreds of cicadas per square yard in the backyard. You can see behind me, we have plenty of woods, which means 17 years ago, we had plenty of cicadas doing what they do best, which is living minimally so they can come back in 17 years. And if you look very carefully at the tree behind me, you can see the shells that they've been discarding on their way up to about 30, 35 feet today.
So move your head for a sec.
Oh, you mean move it consistently one direction?
Yeah. So all these little what appear to be white spots from here are cicadas?
I think so. I'd have to look more carefully myself, but they're maybe from a distance they appear white the way they're catching the sun, but I think maybe we may just be too far.
Have any cicadas dive bombed you yet?
No, not me yet. But we have seen them in motion, and the ones that come out of the shells and are the larger, red-eyed beauties that they are, they're all over the place now. So
are they making a lot of noise?
No, they're not. They're we asked them to be quiet, to respect our time, and they're doing a good job of that. But this is not peak sound for cicadas. It will be days to weeks when they all get that wonderful chorus together, not to be confused with this chorus, but they get their chorus together and make a sound that's unique except for large broods.
Yeah, it's a kind of interesting thing. They come out and they're quiet except for the buzzing associated until they're all out. And then and then somehow they get a memo time for, it's time for the big orgy. Let's start the punk rock sound. I'm
curious how the sound is. I did not live here 17 years ago, so I don't know what it's like, but this is a very wooded neighborhood.
It's going to be super loud.
I think it's going to be great. I want to record really it and mix it into some good hip hop. Maybe I'll get Yaya Fanusi, who actually does some of that, previous guest here, I think, and we can create a cicada hit. Maybe we'll call it "I Believe I Can Fly" and kind of put the cicada sound to the R. Kelly background.
So should we debut that on In Lieu of Fun as part of our cicada coverage?
If we do it, I will consider your offer very strongly, as along with all the other offers we'd be getting.
So, David Priest, welcome back to In Lieu of Fun. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have hundreds of cicadas, and what happens in Northern Virginia is just a few days ahead of what happens in Delaware in this regard. So, Reverend Doctor, watch out. David's present is your future. And they're coming. They have been, we saw a bunch of them out front I took the dogs for a walk, and in the park there were many, many cicadas and many more cicada holes. So Brood 10 is here, and it is not fucking around. What are we talking about today?
I don't know. What do you want to talk about? There's nothing going on in the world.
Grab bag, miscellaneous, a potpourri.
Well, Sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Well, I would like to know again, if one of our esteemed members of the Greek chorus can explain Eurovision Song Contest to me. Apparently, this is a 65-year-old. It's been going on for 65. Do you know what this is, David?
Oh yeah. Eurovision is. I don't know what to compare it to. It's not the cultural equivalent of American Idol, but it has some overlap. It's more. I don't know. It's got a wider appeal. I would say
it's an international pop singing competition.
And I believe it includes, it's expanded now, so isn't Israel part of Eurovision?
Yes, yeah.
Which was,
But I
of
didn't
course,
realize
60
that
years
was
ago.
what you were talking about. I thought it
Yes.
was like
I
some...
assume that's what you're talking about,
Yeah.
Kate, unless there's a Eurovision reference that I'm
No, that's what I'm talking
Well,
about. I've never
Fubar
heard of
knows
this.
about Eurovision, apparently. Should we bring
There
Fubar
you go.
in to explain Eurovision to us?
Sure,
Let's do it.
if Fubar wants to explain
All right,
Eurovision.
it's not really up to him.
So I
He-
guess it's not. I guess it's not in Iceland. It's in the Netherlands, but
Well,
there
it's
is,
pretty far away.
which is pretty far away. Sorry. Well, I misunderstood the person who told me that it was happening. Basically, she was like, "Well, I'm so excited you're coming to Iceland. That's great. We're free whenever." And I was like, "Great, let's hang out on the 22nd when I get in." And she was like, "I'm really sorry, but that's Eurovision." And I was
when
like,
she'll be watching it.
"Yeah." And I was like,
Fubar
"What?"
has rejected us, but John Bordeaux knows about Eurovision too, apparently. So what can you tell us, John?
I know very little about Eurovision, but I do know, as someone said in the chat, that it gave us ABBA. One piece from Riverdance was the first part of Riverdance, and it's an international song contest. The cheering is the best part, because when the nation's song or the nation's representative are singing, the stands are full of their. It's like the World Cup for singing. It's pretty amazing, actually. But to my heart, Riverdance came out of that. It won the contest in '94, I think, and then the entire musical came after that.
Oh, cool.
This
It's a big
is.
deal.
I'm sure it's a big deal. I've heard of it. I've heard countries
I have
get
heard of
excited
this.
when their people do well at Eurovision, but I confess I've never given it a moment's thought, and so it is
Should I go
excellent.
and figure out what's going on when
So
I'm there?
is it happen? So it's not happening in Iceland. It's just that your friend won't hang out with you because
Yeah,
Eurovision is happening somewhere else.
basically.
It sounds like you need new friends.
Well, she's not actually a friend.
It would
She's
be
just
like
a random
inviting
person from
someone
the
to
internet.
America and saying, well, it's Super Bowl night, so you really shouldn't come over then. Or I guess that would be the closest equivalent I can think of.
No,
when
she's
you would know- or
invited
the
me
World
out with
Series
her.
if they were into baseball.
She's invited me
To go
out
watch.
with her to go watch. She just is like, I just don't know if this would interest you.
Okay.
And this is like a thing. So I was trying to basically query whether or not this was a thing that will interest me to other people.
Yeah,
And-
observe it.
Well, let's
If
see.
the
like a
music doesn't
strange
interest you,
ritual.
observe it like a cultural phenomenon.
All right. Well, let's put it to the
The
poll.
ritual of it.
Is Eurovision something Kate should spend an evening on
Oh, yeah.
while in Iceland?
And what else are you gonna do? Walk
I mean,
around
this
by
is
yourself
also
for a
true.
few hours? Man,
Yeah. I mean, I'm not by myself. But
which could
there's
be fun.
Yeah. I mean, I've also
Don't
just
fall.
a lot of
If you walk around for a few hours by yourself, don't fall for the you have to stop by the
Thanks,
hot dog
Colleen.
stand in downtown Reykjavik. Don't do it.
Wait, don't stop by that hot dog stand that everyone keeps telling you
No.
to stop at? Why?
No, that's one of the list of things when we went that we were told, oh, you know the hot dog thing, right? We said no. They said no. There's this one little. It's like a hot dog stand in
Yeah.
this tiny square in
That's
Reykjavik,
exactly
and
how
it's
this has
walkable
been
to almost
described to me.
everything. And they said it's
It's
just
a hot
an
dog
Iceland
stand.
tradition. They have the best hot dogs. You're not going to believe it, but you have to go. And we went, and literally, I'm not a hot dog connoisseur, but literally one of the worst hot dogs I've ever had. None of us could finish the hot dogs we started, and we had to give them to the birds.
Okay, so
So
here's my
I
question,
would not
David.
believe the hype about the hot dogs.
Did
Thank
you
you.
or did you not have desiccated shark while you were in Iceland?
Also, a thing they tell you to not do. Well, people tell me to do it, and then I get other people to tell me not to do it.
Which one, the penis museum or the
No,
the
the
fish? What?
eating the desiccated shark.
Oh no, we did not eat a desiccated shark. Neither did we eat a live shark. We didn't go either way.
'Cause I tasted the shark, and I have to say, fermented. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
fermented, not
This is
desiccated.
the one that they bury for a long period of time, right, Ben?
Yes. So, like, traditional Icelandic cuisine is like you can really see the living hand to mouth quality of life in the, subarctic medieval. Like, there's there's basically no part of an animal that you won't eat. And these sharks, these are Greenland, or they're nurse sharks, whale sharks. And whale sharks are gigantic, and they're poisonous. They have a sort of neurotoxin, and they're really bad for you if you eat them. But if you bury them and let them ferment for, I'm not making this up, 6 months, the toxin goes away, and the shark becomes, the meat becomes actually quite, it's like pickled shark. And I decided that would be worth tasting, and I regretted it. I have to say, it was not.
Really?
It did not.
That surprises me, Ben. what a shocker!
I have to say, I didn't think this would be a surprise, but I noticed in the chat there's a lot of questions about the penis museum reference. That's true.
Yeah.
There is a famous phallological museum in Reykjavik that has members from various species and things like that. It's quite well renowned, but you wonder if they sell membership, right? They have to take advantage of that.
I didn't go to that. I have to say, I was there with my then 13-year-old kid, and I'm not even sure I knew there was a desiccated penis museum in Reykjavik.
Hey, nothing desiccated about it. Yeah. I think that there's actually just like, it's also art too. It's like art, isn't it? Is it all just, I don't know. I thought that it was a mixture of, it was like, but maybe it's
my understanding is, I thought it was both. The range of the phallological arts and sciences was my understanding.
Interesting.
But we did not partake of it because our child was even younger. And we thought, you know what? That
we want to be having that conversation for the rest of our lives.
Yeah,
Drew
so
Rickett
I'm fascinated by, and that probably wouldn't enter into the top 1,000 of the wonderful museums I would visit.
Drew Rickett asks, "What kind of endowment does that museum have?"
Oh,
I think that's the
wow.
Wow. It's good. Well done, Drew. So. Yeah, I think you should. How has the audience voted on Kate spending an evening watching Eurovision in Iceland? Wow, hell yes.
Or yes.
Oh yes.
Yeah, hell yes is definitely winning. My only suggestion is find a place where you can watch Eurovision in a thermal pool with a beer. Yeah. That is.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I think if you're in a thermal pool with a beer, all other problems are temporary and minor.
But most thermal pools are not, wired with large screen TVs nearby. At least the ones that we saw. Maybe we just hang out with the wrong Icelanders. But I got to tell you, maybe Kate, you can have the experience that I had in Iceland. So there we were, minding our own business, which is how most good stories start. So there we are, minding our own business, having a drink in downtown Reykjavik, sitting outside. And my wife and I both notice what we assume are security personnel. Now, it's not like here where they are just blatant about it, but there are people who are walking down the sidewalk and looking in ways that normal people don't move their eyes, but very understated about it. And so she notices it first because she observes better than I do. And she goes, "Do you see what I see?" And I said, "I thought I saw something funny this way." And right then we see a car that's unusual pull up, and we see a couple of other people walk by who are in suits and have earpieces. And we say, okay, something's going on. And maybe a minute later, just walking by us, could almost reach out and touch her, although I didn't, was Angela Merkel, who was just walking out of this hotel in Iceland, going to what it turns out was a meeting of the Arctic Council, where Germany was an observer, and she was attending the head of state summit for the Arctic Council. And she was just walking along, a couple of advisors around her, but not the phalanx of heavy security detail you would expect. That's a metaphor, not an actual phalanx. No one would expect that with the spears and everything. But she walked by and, kind of just smiled and waved. And I said, "You don't know me," so I got very negative on her. But she was very friendly walking by, and anybody could have come up and just chatted with her in that environment. I think it was the kind of the mood of being there rather than the sense of omnipresent security and overbearing security that you would see for a leader here.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of just
So maybe you'll hang out with some European
awesome.
leaders while you're watching Eurovision.
Have I ever told the story of when I went to France to stay in a hostel while I was in spring break from law school, and ended up staying in the ambassador's residence from the United States and going to Michael Kors' birthday party?
No.
No.
Okay. Maybe for another day.
All right. David, your choice. Should we have the agenda set by audience members, or should we can just bring people in to pose their questions and let that set the agenda, or we can do it by diktat?
I say bring on the questions. If people are interested, let's get a conversation going.
All right,
Yeah.
so let's bring back John Bordeaux gets the first question tonight.
Hey, good to see you again, sir. I've missed a few shows recently, so it may have been addressed, but just in case not, it sort of struck me that the IDF use of the press recently to say there was a ground invasion underway, which helped them mass Hamas fighters for targeting, and then they targeted them in the metro. That felt to me like the fake vaccine program in Pakistan to find UBL's residents, like a weapon you fire once and then you can't use again, and has all these cascading effects. Did that strike you the same way? And I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Your thoughts, David? I have thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I'm
That's
dying
it.
to know what you guys are thinking.
I had not gone to that reference point. That had not crossed my mind, but as soon as you say it and I give it the millisecond of thought, like, yeah, no government is good at, and I think it's because no people are very good at thinking about secondary, tertiary effects of actions in a complex, multivariate environment. It's just not how the brain is wired. You think about the immediate. And so it's not surprising to me, perhaps, that they didn't consider what would this mean for the next operation, because almost certainly there will be a next one and a next one and a next one. I'm not convinced that the effect will be that large, though, because I'm also not convinced that there's enough trust on the ground right now anyway that people fully bought into this. So the chance, losing your credibility because of it only works if you have medium to high credibility, and I'm not sure that credibility was there on this issue. But I have not walked along the Israeli-Gaza border. Ben, I think you have. So
yeah, many times. So I agree with that. I think that, first of all, the relations between the IDF and the Western press are famously bad and suspicious. And so I'm not sure there's that much credibility to burn, honestly. That said, I agree with the premise of the question that, this is almost certainly an example of something that is good tactics and bad strategy.
Tactics being short-term and strategy being long-term?
Yeah, I mean, you have a opportunity to use the press to do some disinformation that will amass a whole lot of the people that you want to target in a relatively small number of locations, and that assists your targeting. And the problem is that it erodes your confidence, your ability to interact with that set of interlocutors, not Hamas, but the press in the future. This, of course, you can exacerbate if you then go and rocket and flatten the building that the AP and Al Jazeera are working out of. I don't have any reason to doubt the IDF's claim that Hamas was operating out of that building. The Israelis seem to have presented evidence to the U.S. administration that it finds relatively persuasive. I wouldn't be surprised if it were. I'm not prepared to make a judgment about it, but I certainly don't. I wouldn't bet against that information being accurate. I also, however, if you're the Israeli government and the IDF, you have a long-term problem of legitimacy that in these confrontations the preservation of your assets in which are very important, and weighing that against short-term tactical advantage is something that, you know, every military commander in history would see this as a good operation, and a political leader might say, well, wait a minute, you're going to kill a bunch of Hamas guys, but I'm still going to have to deal with the press after you do it. And so I basically agree with David. I think it's, you know, it's, and I think John's analogy to the vaccine program in Abbottabad, which, by the way, I think is much more defensible, because the target is so high value and so exceptional. So those are my instincts about it.
Yeah. Let me add one thought, if I can, and then I'll be quiet. So, Kate, you can actually enlighten us on this one. But one thing occurs to me, which is this idea that maybe there wasn't a viable, valid target there, I think is ridiculous, because one thing the Israelis generally have, and I don't know about this particular building, but generally have, is absolutely exquisite intelligence about places like Gaza buildings. And imagining that they would take a shot at this building, announce it in advance, which means it wasn't a quick opportunity strike, but something that was considered and went through some version of process, and do that knowing that the AP offices were in the building. Of course, there was a valid Hamas target nearby or in the building that could only be got at that way. Because if not, this is not a case like the US hitting the Chinese embassy during the Balkans conflicts, where it was a true case of mistaken identity. It was bad, outdated maps, and there was an immediate apology to the Chinese government. That's not the case here. The Israelis are saying, no, we had a target. The problem is they're saying, trust us. And who is an independent verifier of such things normally? The press. And you've just taken out their building. So that is the PR crisis they put themselves in. But I have no doubts that there was a valid target, according to their measurement of validity, that there was a valid target there.
Well, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but this is mere, I don't have any thoughts on this, except that I want to try to understand and make sure that like all of my information is correct, because suffice it to say that when it comes to anything related to the Palestine and Israeli conflict, it is very hard to find sources. And I learned this when I was 18 and tried to teach it to myself on Wikipedia for like 3 days. Don't do that, folks, if you're playing along at home. But seriously, so there seems to be two different things that we're conflating here, and they do seem to be there's two kind of indirect and direct, two indirect attacks on the press. The first is that they harnessed the press's use, by basically manipulating them and duping them into reporting false information so they could kill more Hamas soldiers, and therefore have higher value airstrikes in some regard, right, in the tunnels. The second part is that they bombed the AP building, which was evacuated, but which likely had a Hamas cell in it in some capacity, right? And so even though they both involve journalists are never the direct target, but they're basically what is the term for when you're on the sidelines and you get
collateral
damage. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just my brain is I'm tired. But collateral damage.
Dead civilians is the reality.
Right. No, and dead civilians is of course the reality. But both of these things seem, so forgive me for being fairly naive, but both of these things seem not about the press necessarily, in any way. And but they do seem to be a pretty immoral or a level of immorality around attacking the press in a way that's slightly or using the press in a way that's slightly unprecedented. Civilians are known collateral damage. There's some type of like slight, like special status that the press has. Maybe that doesn't exist in this kind of situation. What do you think, David?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think there's a difference here between attacking the press and using the press. And in the building situation, I don't call that an attack on the press. And that seems ridiculous, right? Because it's the offices of Al Jazeera and the AP.
Well, don't you think that there was probably a level that they put their headquarters or their cell there specifically for that reason?
That I don't know. It would not be unheard of. There are other cases plenty of
Ben,
cases
you're muted.
In history and other settings where you've had, and you call them whatever you want to. You can call them the whole spectrum from freedom fighters to resistance fighters to terrorists, but people who have been fighting asymmetrically of using everything from hospitals to journalism to try to avoid attacks and capture. This would not be unusual. But I have no information as to whether Hamas was doing that. Israel thought they were doing that. Israel thought they had a valid target that was worth taking the hit from telling the press to evacuate a building and wiping out the building. I'm in that position where I certainly don't like it, but I can understand the rationale for it depending on the level of their target and the immediacy of the threat. You could actually hit some of those just war considerations if a number of things are true that we just don't know yet.
Right. So a few things about this. One is that Hamas is unusually aggressive about embedding in civilian infrastructure. Hezbollah is similar, but Hamas is really, there's a density to the civilian population of Gaza. It's a very small area. It has 2 million people in it. And it's one of the most densely populated places in the world. And so if you're embedding in civilian population in southern Lebanon, which is quite sparsely populated, that's a different animal from how many civilians you're surrounding yourself with when you do it in Gaza. Hamas specializes in this. And it is certainly, if the Israelis are right, it is certainly not an accident that Hamas was operating out of the same building as international press. It would have been intentional. And it also would not be an accident that the Associated Press would have been unaware of it, because a reputable news organization wouldn't do that knowingly. And so, the Associated Press is quite reasonably saying, hey, we've been in this building for 15 years. We had no idea. If there was any Hamas presence, we had no idea of it. And the Israelis are either reasonably or falsely saying, we have ironclad intelligence that there was a Hamas intelligence unit in that building. There's no way to resolve this dispute in the abstract. The Israelis are either right, in which case what they did, if it's a significant Hamas presence, what they did is probably reasonable. They warned everybody to get out. Nobody was killed, by the way.
At least defensible, right.
Right. Yeah. And they attacked a legitimate military target, by the way, that the laws of war forbid embedding in civilian infrastructure. If the Israelis are wrong on the factual claim, then, they deserve all the criticism they get.
Right.
And it will not be a saving grace to say that they were wrong by accident. They weren't lying, they were wrong. You don't take down the headquarters of an international press organization in a war zone and escape criticism with an oops.
Yeah.
And that's where I have the assumption of due diligence being done. Obviously, I have not worked in the Israeli government, nor would I, but seeing the kinds of things, I'll just leave it at this. Having been part of similar things in other contexts, I know that there would be some kind of process and due diligence going into that. And that would be gross negligence if it were not true that there were some justification.
And yet mistakes happen. Most famously, we took out, the Chinese embassy in in Serbia.
But I will point out the level of intelligence that we must assume the IDF has on buildings in Gaza
It's
is
like very high,
substantially more
Yes.
than what we had. Quite, we, the U.S. government, had admitted what we had. We were using
Old phone books.
Old phone books and old tourist maps.
Wait, are you
And
talking
yet-
about the Chinese
Dated,
embassy?
and yet they
Yeah.
Phone
and yet they
books
did it
and
anyway.
tourist maps?
And we blew up
There's
the
a-
Chinese
there's a-
embassy by mistake when we
Yeah,
were in the late
You
90s.
use the best material you have, and sometimes
Oh,
the best
God.
material you have
I
is open
remember
source
that.
and dated, things like phone books. And
But look,
you make
the-
a catastrophic mistake.
The Israelis are very good, and they also make mistakes. Gaza is really densely populated. There's another entity that's really good, which is Hamas. They're really good at this game. And, they...
And also manipulating the press.
Yes.
Yep.
And so
Absolutely.
they're not as good at it as Hezbollah, which is really the best. But they're good at it. And they... and there's a long-term cat and mouse game that is it's a multivariate, very complicated game, and there's 2 million civilians right in the immediate vicinity. And the Israelis are excellent at this, and they screw up frequently. And by the way, even when they don't screw up, they kill a lot of civilians. Because if you have a high value target and it's a shot you're going to take, you may get the split second wrong when the fewest number of that person's family are around. And so it's a bad situation. It is always the better way to handle these is not to have major flare-ups in Gaza, which is what's happened over the last bunch of years. Actually,
No land wars in Asia and no flare-ups in Gaza. Let's all agree on those.
A fair bit of restraint over the last bunch of years on both sides, and that's broken down for reasons we can talk about right now. But the only way you avoid large numbers of innocent people getting killed is not to have these flare-ups.
Can I ask a related question that I've been having recently on Twitter, which is that I've been seeing a lot of people call for the forced silence around talking about Israel. Do you know what I'm talking about? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? There's I might have a lot of very lefty, very pro-Palestine friends in my feed, so I might be getting this, but generally speaking, it seems to be kind of this idea of people don't want to stand up. The implication seems to be that there's no way to, there's no, as kind of Tammy is really said very well in her article, no two-state kind of solution anymore, and that you have to it's falling away, and that instead people are getting very tribal, and they're even more than already was happening in the territory, but not spilling over into social media. And that if you don't stand, and the kind of insertion of various types of Black Lives Matters and other types of kind of ethnic and racial politics into the conflict in the Middle East. Yeah. And I'm just so overwhelmed by it. And I just have honestly been sticking my head in a hole, but then I don't know if I'm part of the problem in some way. And it just seems epically complicated and too simple a comparison that's very uninformed. I don't know.
Well,
is this a terrible question to ask? I don't even know if maybe I shouldn't ask this at a dinner party, but I don't
Well, there's a legitimate point here, definitely. And to me, what's fascinating to me, having followed Middle East politics in various capacities for 25 some years, is, and not being as close to the Palestinian-Israeli question of that, but having followed it for a while, is just how open it is, in part because of social media, that there are conversations going on among influencers that could not have happened even 20, 25 years ago, because we didn't have that expression of feeling. Does it matter? That's where I'm not sure. But it is fascinating to me that I have been and am exposed when I go into Twitter and I see really good arguments being made for some points on the IDF side and really good points being made on the anti-IDF side. in ways that I wasn't hearing in an academic environment, in a government environment, and in a pre-full social media environment. I think that's a good thing. The fact that I'm hearing different points of view and I'm getting to see people express themselves on that. There is also the everyone's an expert phenomenon, which is disgusting on social media, which is you've got somebody who's a fashion model who is getting a lot of attention about what she's saying about the issue, more so than people who have studied the region for decades, like one particular member of the Wittes family. So I do have that issue going on, but I'm seeing some of what you're seeing, Kate, is I'm seeing some of that tendency, but in a much different way than we saw with the Mearsheimer-Walt issue having to do with criticizing Israel, which is now getting on almost a decade ago.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a silly question at all. Look, there are elements of the right wing and the Jewish community, which are, by the way, distinct but overlapping sets, that will call you an anti-Semite if you express concern about Palestinian lives, and if you express sorrow.
That seems uninteresting to me.
Well, I'm just getting started here.
I know.
And, you know, if you express concern that Israeli response may be disproportionate, or that there may be racism in Israeli society that has something to do with why these domestic disturbances, which are quite different from the Hamas rocketing, may have started in the first place, and that Israeli policy may have something to do with this, you will get branded an anti-Semite. There are parts of the left where, and I tweeted some of this today, where, you know, places where Jews are being attacked in London, and people chant "Death to the Jews" in a expression of support for, you know, Palestinian rights. That's just simple racism. You know, there are places in the American left where to say that Israel, but what is Biden being criticized for on the left? It's the assertion that Israel has the right to defend itself, which is a non-controversial proposition. Should be a that if a terrorist group is launching very large, you know, literally thousands of missiles at the heartland of a country, that the country might respond to that. It's in and of itself a completely unobjectionable proposition, and there are elements of the sort of muddled middle that quite reasonably regard this environment as sufficiently toxic in all directions that you don't really know what you can say and what you can't say. And I think the environment is toxic, and I think, you know, my advice for everybody who, you know, wants to have an opinion about this subject is study it intensively for 4 years before you try to have an opinion. And
I would have suggested 40, but 4 is
What do you
okay.
mean?
Yeah.
I spent 3 days on the fucking Wikipedia page, Ben. Like, that's not enough for you.
And by the way, if you're inclined to attack somebody for their expressions of concern on behalf of somebody's lives, if you've never been to Sderot, you know, there are people there who have nothing to do with this conflict. I mean, except that they live in a rocket zone. They didn't ask for this any more than the people that Hamas in Gaza did. And if you're not concerned about the babies on one side or the other that get rocketed, there's just something wrong. And if you're looking for if your immediate reaction to this is, this validates who I already knew was bad, because you're not thinking seriously about it. And so I actually think, Kate, your question is perfectly reasonable, and I don't think there's no simple answer to the question, you know, what's going on here and who should I be angry at?
I love that you say that. Thank you so much, because I feel so trepidatious even asking questions in this space. I'm afraid of like inadvertently signaling that I feel a certain way and I don't, or like that I have priors and I honestly don't. Like I just like kind of am trying to take it all in, and it's very difficult. And it reminds me a lot in a weird way, although this is going to be a strange like kind of parallel, but it reminds me of this case that I teach in property law called Johnson v. McIntosh, which is one of the first cases that you learn in property law, which is about basically a group of Native Americans conveying property to like early settlers, and then like the settlers settling the land, developing it for 45, 60 years. And then by the time the US government decided to move west, like, and wanted to settle that land and formalize it, the US government said that all previous like transfers of land were invalid, and that that they had it all and now it was theirs and they could give it to whoever they wanted. And so like basically the Supreme Court Marshall validated this, like saying essentially like, no, that doesn't, we discovered the land in like 65 years after it had been settled and like farmed, we discovered the land and we're going to have this, and casting aside kind of like Native people's concerns. But the biggest thing that I take away from that story is that like no one fucking wins. Like there is no one who's going to go back and turn back the hands of time and win that story. Like the US government wasn't there. The Native peoples were. They got screwed out of their land in some way. Then the early settlers got screwed out of their land in some way. Everyone's pissed. No one really wins except the US government. And they're just kind of like...
And any attempt to try it fails to pass the purity test of the constituency that's developed. So it's a bad news story. Chris, I need you to do something positive here. Please don't let your question be about death and destruction.
No, it'll be about Western Sahara. Yeah. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm sorry, David. I have another hard problem question. And it's one that I sort of tend to ask you about every time you're on, probably because there just happens to be like recent developments in it. And it has to do with the directed energy attacks. Mark Zaid, the noted attorney who represents not just whistleblowers, but former sort of people who felt wronged by the IC. He says that he's got people that say that these cases go back to the 60s, back to the Cold War, and this is not something that just happened in the last 5 or 6 years. Yep. So does that, this could just be all something that spy versus spy that we're not meant to see, and just too much is already out in the open, and it gets people sort of curious for like they want a resolution to an ambiguous problem. But does the longevity of these attacks and I guess the sort of, as far as we can tell, the U.S. not responding to end these once and for all. He says his theory is either that we do it ourselves, which I don't believe, or that these attacks are so like compartmented in sort of what it actually is happening, that it's just not, the public space is not the right venue for this to play out, and that it will be dealt with at the administration level that we don't have a need to know about. So does these sort of longevity of the attacks change the calculus for it's not a 5 or 6 year problem, but a 50 or 60 year problem with the Russians?
Right on. You've opened up one of my many Pandora's boxes here of thoughts. Because anything I say is dangerous because we know so little. And when we learn more, it could invalidate probably 99% of what I'm going to say here. But here's how I frame this issue is something has happened to a significant number of U.S. personnel in various locations. That seems to be true. We also know from scientists who actually study this the most that there is no physical mechanism by which what is being thrown around by the media as the cause of the attacks, and I'll come back to attacks and tell you why I put them in these air quotes, but the mechanism by which these attacks cause the symptoms that have been described without causing other much more visible symptoms. We also know that there is some information that has not been revealed yet. And I think those are about the only three things we know. Now, you overlap those, and what you get is, and I'm going to use a scientific term here, what you get is a clusterfuck, because you have actual people suffering. And I know some of these people. You have people suffering from symptoms. Human nature, you look for a cause. And that cause looks like it is some kind of consistent and persistent enemy action. Whatever that is, someone is causing this to happen to me. You also have people saying, well, what you're describing is happening. And some of the common symptoms are, dizziness, hearing different noises, having a sense of a nauseated feeling, among many others. But what you're not seeing is cases of significant skin damage. And most of the scientists who study the wavelengths that could cause this if heavily boosted say, well, you would be seeing a lot of other things other than just the symptoms described. Well, those two don't work well, because what it sounds like is to somebody who feels sick is you're not taking my pain seriously. And to the scientists, it sounds like you're saying you're not taking my expertise seriously about the physical laws of nature. That doesn't work well when you have both, the Twitter sphere and in media saying, well, we need an answer right now. The one thing that has come out is that there's something inside the intelligence community. NSA released something. I think Mark Zaid has put this out there, that they've released something saying, like, yes, of course we're investigating these purported attacks. And he's like, aha, you admit there are attacks. Well, we don't know yet. There are cases in history, both of coordinated attacks that we didn't know the cause of. In a case like in espionage, it's the umbrella with ricin tablet stuck into a Bulgarian dissident, and we didn't know what happened at the time, or polonium-210. There are cases of things that we have to figure out the cause of. There are also cases of people, mass hysteria is the wrong term, and I hate it, but there are cases of people having unexplained symptoms and jumping on to whatever they think other people have said that are similar enough that it must be the same kind of attack coming at them. So that doesn't help us. That doesn't give us something diagnostic to determine what's going on. So what we're left with is a very unsatisfying situation, right? Where you have people who are suffering saying, help me and help me figure out what happened. And we don't want it to happen to other people. And you've got a very unclear situation scientifically about what possible mechanism there is that could cause this. In that realm, it's very easy to get things wrong and very hard to get things right. And I'm holding back as much as I can because I'm an analyst by training. I want information. I need to have a few more data points to know what is more likely and what is less likely. And if I had to put money on it now, Christopher, I'd say there is some systematic effort being known, and we just haven't yet identified the mechanism from the attack vector to the symptoms we're seeing. But I am highly skeptical of what I've been seeing in the press so far.
Charles, the floor is yours.
Hi, David. On the subject of clusterfucks, so my question for you is, what, if any, analytic tradecraft like mistakes do you think have been made over the years regarding the forecasting of a third intifada? It seems like both on the popular side and even those who should know better have been either forecasting when is going to come or will come over the years. There's the tendency to Chicken Little on the one side, and on the other hand, we could, there is a potential that this could be the one. So, what are the key lessons learned, I guess, that you would bring from these various instances?
Right on. Yeah, forecasting within the intelligence community specifically, but within analysis more widely, forecasting and a version of it called warning analysis, there's an inherent bias there, right? If you're trying to warn of something, you are biased towards looking for indicators of that thing happening. And so there tends to be over-prediction of whatever happened last time, either that we missed or we got right, but we see similar factors happening now. So I think there has generally been over-prediction of numerous kinds of revolutions, social movements, the Intifada, other things where we see similar variables stacking up, because that's what you're looking for. That's the light on which you're shining the variables, so you look at the variables within that light. However, we're generally bad at doing that kind of analysis and looking at new variables that change the situation. So we will continue to have a bias towards over-predicting what has happened already and saying it will happen again for some of the same reasons. I don't know how to correct for that. Honestly, if I were a manager in an analytic enterprise, I would be looking at some structured analytic techniques, certainly. I would be looking at team A, team B type analysis. But I'm not sure there's a good way against that unless you have almost a balancing function to the warning function, where you have almost a team that is looking at specifically new and creative variables and trying to be the kind of the pain in the ass in those conversations to say, yeah, but you're not considering the role of X. That's really hard to do in a human context.
That's really interesting. I think there's a particularized factor related to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank that is, and formerly Gaza, that accentuates this problem in this context, which is that when you look at the situation, can, a society as complex and divided as Israel rule effectively over 5 million, 6 million unwilling Palestinians? I mean, whether you think it's 3.5 because you don't think about Gaza or think about it as the whole thing, right? Can you do that?
Divide up willing and unwilling. Yeah.
There's an inherent bias that I think sounds in rational thought to say that's not stable, that's not a sustainable situation. And so a lot of analysts, and I would certainly include myself among them, though I'm not a professional analyst in this area by any means, start with the assumption that the situation is inherently unsustainable. And then the question becomes, well, how long before it blows up? And so you look at every eruption as a possible, and the question reflects that maybe this is the time, right? There's this assumption that eventually it's going to happen. And the Israeli right does not share that assumption. They start with the assumption that the status quo is in fact sustainable.
Right.
And that, one of the interesting things about the last 30 years is that they have been proven right about that for a much longer period of time than people like me thought was conceivable. And I look at it and I say, I don't understand how this situation is as sustainable as it is, but it is much more sustainable than many of us understood in the late 1980s when the first Intifada happened, and we reacted by saying, oh, the situation is combustible, non-sustainable, however many million Israelis there are can't rule over however many million Palestinians there were at the time. The numbers, of course, are always disputed. And therefore you need a peace process, right? And the assumption behind that, other than the moral assumption, was that there was an inherent bias analytically in favor of the instability of the situation. And actually the situation has been much more durable than we understood.
Certainly.
Marcelo, the floor is yours.
Hi, I have first time asking a question. Question for all three of you, and the question is sort of in two parts. The first is, I kind of want to get your take on what you think the relative coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict has been compared to all other geopolitical conflicts that might be of interest to the United States in the past 30 years. And by order of magnitude, I think, not so much why, I think we can all kind of intuit about American culture. And the second question is, what effect this kind of coverage has had on shaping public opinion? And it's more like a prognosticate or a counterfactual. If it got way less coverage, how would people showing up to it for the first time kind of form opinions about it? In part because, as David said, in the Twitter sphere, everyone has an opinion and a half.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating question because
It's a really good question.
not just every sentence you said, but every phrase you said packs so much into it. So, talking about the impression of it based on American interest, we can analyze, and people have spent their careers analyzing what is U.S. interest regarding this conflict compared to others, such that you can have literally millions of people dying in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo and the related Great Lakes area, and nowhere near the same amount of attention that you get to the Israeli-Palestinian
or
conflict.
Uyghurs,
or
Myanmar.
There you go.
Or sorry,
the list goes on, and it's absolutely shocking at a fundamental human level that we're so bad, and yet it totally makes sense based on social psychology of definitions of in-groups and out-groups. Of course, Americans overall, whether culturally, religiously, politically, are going to associate more with Israelis overall than they are with people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is a fact. It is unfortunate from what you would try to call a neutral moral sense, but it's true. To me, the issue, again, goes back to this: where do people get information, and is that changed by social media? What's fascinating to me, and I would love to see some good scholarship on this, maybe a future guest, and we can all talk to her about it or him about it, is to what degree has social media changed the traditional dominant American situation of what we would call the major media influencing the United States on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I would love to see that. I haven't seen anything on that, but I'll be frank, I have not searched it out. So it would be good to know what is changing in that regard.
I'm going to give you a totally unprincipled answer to your question. The answer to your question, for me at least, depends entirely whom I'm talking to. So if I'm talking to American leftists who, China can kill or lock up 1.5 million Uyghurs, and they don't even seem to notice. 5 million people can be displaced in Syria, and there's not a single campus protest about it. And, Israel, which, has a lot of flaws as a society, and I hope I'm never, I never cover those up or apologize for them. It is actually a country that is struggling hard with what are recognizably Western democratic norms and how to live them in a very difficult environment. Gets wildly disproportionate attention from the American left, and so and the European left for that matter, and the world media. And if I'm talking to one of those people, I do think your question has validity. Why don't you care when other people in the world who are not firing, when other people in the world are suffering a lot? Now, when I'm talking to Israelis or American Jews, I take a completely different attitude toward it. And I say, stop whining about, you don't represent Israel as China or Syria or the Democratic Republic of Congo. You represent Israel as a modern democratic state. And if people are responding to the deficiencies of its performance against that measure, saying, well, it's better than China, is giving away the frickin' game. And that's that should be beneath you. And I think, one of the reasons this round of conflict broke out is that the Israeli government is content to turn over a bunch of Palestinian houses that people have lived in Sheikh Jarrah since 1950-ish, because of technical deficiencies in the deeds that would-be settlers have been able to exploit. If you're okay with that, or regard that as it's better than what China's doing to the Uyghurs, it's at least legal, but it's not okay. And, count me with the Palestinian residents of Sheikh Jarrah, and for that matter of Jaffa, on the basic ability to have property rights in your houses in a non-discriminatory fashion. And I don't see any reason when I'm talking to, if I'm talking to, Israelis or Jews, don't ask me to apologize for that. Don't ask me to explain that. I'm not going to do it. I know that neighborhood, and I'm not interested in making what you're doing look pretty, or look okay. And so I guess I say to, in your response to your question, it totally depends who the audience is. In a neutral sense, I would say your point is absolutely right. Israel gets disproportionate negative attention. It also asks for it because it and I think we should all be aware that Israel is a society that has problems and deals with some of them really well and deals with some of them really badly. And we shouldn't be afraid of that. And we also shouldn't be interested in covering up those problems by comparison to regimes that are in fact barbaric. So that's my super unprincipled, rather muddled answer to your question.
I would just say that I really loved that, Ben. That was great. I've used this quote before. I would just say that there's a Gloria Steinem quote that basically that we sort the world and communities by the things that are the most easily defined and most visible between us. And I think that we both sort and basically pick and discriminate based on those facts. And I think that basically that is incredibly true when you talk about local versus international attention and other things. And so we don't, for every job lost in North Carolina at a furniture factory, we don't count the number of families in China that have gained lifestyle and three families that are supported in China because of a job that goes there. And that there's that type of, that there is this, and that's in the positive sense. And in the negative sense, I just think that it's the reason to a certain extent that we don't pay attention to people who are in different civilizations that have, and I think to a large extent actually, is pure racism, pure kind of xenophobia, which is just kind of the idea of if they're committing whatever's going on there, that's happening there, and we don't understand that, and so we're going to let them sort it out on their own, type of thing. And to a certain extent, I do think that because America has been so involved in Israel's success for so long, that there's a real kind of idea, when I've never heard this before. I went to Israel, and when I went there and was at Tel Aviv University, they were oh yeah, there's a reason they call us the 51st state. And I was what? They call you the 51st state? No one fucking told me that.
No, they call themselves the 51st state. I
was seems aspirational. I was Puerto Rico and Guam and maybe DC would get in there before you, but
yeah, no, but this is this is a very typically Israeli expression, because they wouldn't. There is no interest in being, part of, they just mean it as a reflection. It's like the way the British say special relationship.
Oh, no. I put that together eventually, but I was like, this is a weird, because that would have it has a very certain different balance when we talk about statehood in DC and Puerto Rico and Guam when you're domestic. And it was very pronounced. So anyways, I just think that, that's all to say that it's a great question, Marcelo. Thank you so much for coming on. And for the first time, it's been a while since we've had a brand new question asker. So Richard,
you get the last question today. We seem to have lost David Priest.
I know. Yeah. I don't know what happened.
We're working on getting him back, but
Ben, did you psychically will him to disappear?
That's since I invited him
I think
as
he got
my mystery
overtaken
guest.
by cicadas.
Maybe he got eaten by cicadas. What's on your mind, Richard?
So, just watching this as things unfold in Israel, one of the things that's puzzled me is just how tight or porous is the blockade of the Gaza Strip. And I've been hearing things about Iran actually being able to assist Hamas at this time, and so I'm puzzled what is going on there, and also just what is there a long-term objective to this blockade? Or are we just looking at an open-ended war of attrition, and Gaza will be blockaded for who knows how long?
So this is a subject that I've done like a strangely large amount of work on over the years. And I just shared in the chat a piece that I wrote with Matt Waxman a number of years ago about the crossing point for goods between Israel and Gaza, which is called Kerem Shalom. This is a subject I could literally talk about for 2 hours, and so I'm going to try to give you the 2-minute version of it, which is the blockade on Gaza. First of all, it's a very unusual blockade because all goods that in fact get into Gaza come in through Israel. So it's other than smuggled goods, that is. So it's it's an interesting question whether the word blockade is quite the right word for it, right? It's a selective blockade, and it amps up and amps down depending on circumstances. The short version of it is the Israelis have a list of items which is quite long, that they do not allow into Gaza because Hamas uses them to make rockets, make explosives, make all kinds of things. A lot of these are dual-use technologies that are routinely used for perfectly reasonable purposes as well. And so the hardship this causes for Palestinians is very real. In addition, the Israelis have essentially cut off the water access so that really all the goods have to go through Kerem Shalom. The problem, of course, is that for a long time, there was extensive tunneling under the Egyptian border, which the Israelis do not control. And this was done tunneling was a big part of Gaza life. This lasted for a long time, and a lot of stuff could get into Gaza that the Israelis couldn't control because it was coming in through the Egyptian side. The new Egyptian government, the Sisi government, which is as viewers of this show know from May al-Sudani, a terrible, violently repressive government. It did, however, really because Hamas is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is the government that they overthrew, the Morsi government. They are quite hostile to Hamas, and they basically flooded the Hamas tunnels with seawater. Now, this was a very effective thing to do by way of shutting down a lot of tunneling, which is still going on, but it's not going on with Egyptian collusion in the same way. The problem is that it flooded.
I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So is tunneling like this huge thing on the
Yes.
border?
Yes.
Okay. I
Huge.
did not. Sorry. I've now heard a lot about tunnels, and I'm
It's different on the Israeli border than on the Egyptian border. On the Egyptian border, it's mostly for goods. On the Israeli side, it's mostly to create entryways into Israel to kill people. And so the Israelis, so the Egyptians basically flooded the aquifer with seawater, which makes a lot of Gaza's native water supply undrinkable. So it's been actually a disaster.
It also makes the land unarable.
It is
terrible.
Seawater
in the land is terrible.
It's completely horrible, but the amount of smuggling has reduced as a result of it. So the answer is there's still stuff that comes in from the Egyptian side, a fair bit. There is a lot of material that comes in legally through the Israeli side, and there's other stuff that comes in smuggled by one means or another, including smuggled from the Israeli side through Kerem Shalom, which is imperfect, of course. So the answer is it's a very complicated combination of blockade and importation system, and it is quite porous. Could the Israelis shut it down more completely? Yes. They couldn't do it without starving a lot of people. So, add that to your list of super complex. And by the way, if you read the piece that Matt and I wrote, which is about how difficult it is to run Kerem Shalom, you will see why things are so expensive in Gaza, why they're why the problem is so intractable. Just to get food into Gaza is really, really hard. So it's a really there's no nice way to talk about this. Well, we have lost David Priest and we're over time anyway. So why don't we? We didn't get to say goodbye to David, but goodbye, David. Thank you for joining us.
I love David Priest. He's such a good human. He always has the best stories and kind of just wonderful, thoughtful perspective. And there's a reason he works for you, Ben. I can see it.
I like David's a great American, and even if he's not here to hear it. But we will be back 22 hours and 46 minutes from now with John McWhorter to talk about the most unspeakable word in the English language.
I'm going to read this. I have ones to add.
Let's store them all up and talk about words we're not supposed to say.
It's going to be a very punchy show. Can we hold on, Ben, really quickly before the John McWhorter thing, can we have a brief conversation about, are we going to say the word that we don't want to say?
My view is the guest here to talk about the word
he can make the rules.
Should say the word as he sees fit.
Okay.
And I do not intend to.
Okay. Same. Okay, great.
We will be back 22 hours and 45 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but we do have a lot of bad words and John McWhorter tomorrow. And we just had the amazing David Priest on to talk about some really serious stuff in a tree filled of cicadas.